So, beliefs that people had about children inform the types of literature that was available to children, or in this case, not available to children. So, you might remember from your history classes in high school or earlier in your college career that the Enlightenment was also called the Age of Reason. It took place roughly from the late 1600s to the early 1800s. So, during this time, people believed that children were actually smaller versions of adults. They did not see children as being different from adults. They were just little adults, not children. So it wasn't until the 1800s that childhood was accepted by many people as a distinct phase of life. If you think about child labor laws in the United States in the 1800s, you might be aware that many children actually went to work in factories for long hours, and it wasn't until, if memory serves correctly, the late 1800s or early 1900s when we began passing child labor laws in the United States. So, in the late 1600s, the philosopher John Locke, who you see pictured on this slide, suggested that there actually should be books expressly written for children in his work, Some Thoughts Concerning Education. So, we're going to backtrack a minute here to the era before the Enlightenment. So, looking at the period between 1400 and 1600. So, sometime between 1440 and 1450, Gutenberg invented the printing press, and this was a very significant accomplishment in the history of books in general, not just in children's literature, right? Because before the printing press was invented, books had to be handwritten. Can you imagine sitting down at your desk and writing a book by hand? It would take you a long time and it would be a lot of effort. Your hand would be very tired. It would not be fun, right? So you can probably imagine that buying a handwritten book would be very expensive. And if you imagine that, you would be correct. Only very wealthy people had handwritten books because they were so expensive. In 1440, we began to see the emergence of hornbooks or lesson paddles. So a hornbook, which you see pictured on the slide, is actually a wooden paddle, and they would typically have like ABCs or primers or Bible verses printed on them, and they would actually be covered with a translucent, it's hard to say that word, sheet of cow horn over the lesson paddle so that it could be protected and used by multiple children over a long period of time. So the fact that cow horn was actually covering the lesson paddle gave it the name a hornbook. So moving ahead between 1600 and 1800, there were some children's books available, but they were not meant to entertain or to inform like the children's books that we have today. In fact, they were written to indoctrinate children with social values. And this likely came from the belief of the Puritans that children were wicked and had to be saved, and the literature available to them, at least in the fledgling United States, reflected that belief. So, for example, John Cotton published the very first book for American children in 1656 called, long title, Spiritual Milk for Boston Babes in Either England, drawn from the breasts of both testaments for their souls' nourishment. So, very different from the children's books that we have today, as you can gather from the title of that book. Not so sure that would be a book I would want to read, but who am I to judge? Anyhow, so during the same time period, one of the very first picture books for children was published, and that was called the Orbis Pictus, which roughly translates to The World in Pictures, and it was considered to be one of the first nonfiction picture books for children, and it featured some woodcut illustrations. And this book was different from many of the other books that were being published at the time because it was meant to inform children about the world around them. It wasn't one of those books that was trying to indoctrinate them. So during this time period, there weren't really a lot of books intended for children, and the ones that were available were like this one that we see here, right? So it's not surprising that children tended to read books that were actually intended for adults, and this persisted throughout the period to about 1800. So for example, Charles Perrault published Tales of Mother Goose, which included books or stories such as Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella. I know that might surprise you because now in the present time, we tend to think of stories like that as being written for children, but in fact, that was not true at the time that these stories were published. They were actually intended for adults. Also, books that you may have heard of today, like Gulliver's Travels, The Swiss Family Robinson, Robinson Crusoe, all of those were titles that were written for adults, but frequently read by children. Children also like to read chapbooks. So chapbooks were very cheaply published books that could be purchased for very little on the streets. And the Puritans really didn't have a very high opinion of chapbooks. They tended to be frowned upon. And chapbooks often had stories like the tales of Robin Hood as well as tales of King Arthur, which, as you can imagine, were likely appealing to children because they had a lot of adventure in them. And one of the very most important developments in this time occurred during the 1700s when John Newberry, and that name might be familiar to you, because you may have heard of the Newbery Medal, which is considered to be one of the most prestigious children's book awards in the world. Anyway, so John Newberry established the very first publishing house meant for children. And we're actually going to now take a book break and learn more about John Newberry. So enjoy your book break.